Hey everyone. Tonight we delve into the most enigmatic and terrifying aspect of ancient Greek mythology, the forbidden knowledge of the Oracle of Delphi. Imagine you are standing on the sun-bleached slopes of Mount Parnassus, the wind whipping through your hair, the distant clang of a hero's sword echoing from a forgotten battle. You're not just a passive observer. You're there, a witness to the profound and unsettling truth that history has tried to bury. What if the most revered source of wisdom in the ancient world was built on a foundation of lies? What if the prophecies that shaped empires and sealed the fates of legendary heroes were not gifts from a benevolent god, but something far more sinister? You probably won't want to believe what you are about to hear. So before the tension gets too high, take a moment to like the episode and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Close your eyes, imagine the ancient mountains, and let's unravel this epic tale together. The story of the Oracle isn't a beginning. It's a terrifying end. It's the final chapter of a forgotten deity, primordial being that existed long before the Olympians ever dreamed of glory. The first priestess, a simple girl named Theon, was chosen not for her piety, but for a strange and unsettling quirk. She was the only one who could hear the mountain's whispers. The first priestesses of Delphi, who preceded the more famous Pythia, were not chosen by lot or divine sign. They were selected because of a peculiar and documented medical condition, a subtle neurological affliction that caused them to be hypersensitive to the earth, subtle vibrations to hear the low hum that others dismissed as wind or the rumbling of distant storms. This specific detail, often dismissed by historians, hints at the oracle's true origin. Imagine Theon, a young woman with a delicate constitution, tending to her simple flock on the slopes. She feels the earth's pulse not just through her feet but inside her very bones. It's a rhythmic thrum, a silent, powerful voice that calls to her. One evening, as twilight bleeds across the sky, she follows the thrum to a narrow fissure in the rock. The air here is thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and floral, like decay and blossom intertwined. A bizarre detail about the oracle's sanctuary involves the very rock it was built upon. The site was once known as the Omphalos, the navel of the world, marked by a strange, conical stone that was said to be the center of creation. But ancient texts describe this stone as feeling strangely warm to the touch, and some records even suggest it had a faint, almost imperceptible pulse. As Theon approaches the fissure, the pulsing grows louder. Not in her ears, but inside her head, a telepathic thump that threatens to crack her skull. She feels a profound psychological pull, a hypnotic draw that she cannot resist. The air, thick with a vapor that no one else can see, makes her feel both lucid and dizzy, as if she is seeing 1,000 truths at once. The first revelation is not a grand pronouncement, but a chilling vision of a great serpent, a chthonic deity named Python, sleeping not in the earth beneath her, but as the earth beneath her. It is not dead, not truly, but merely resting, its consciousness seeping through the stone and soil like a dark, sentient oil. Theon's heart pounds. She sees the serpent's mind, not as a reptile's, but as a vast, ancient intellect that has witnessed the birth and death of eons. It has no malice, no goodness, only the cold indifference of eternity. It is the forbidden knowledge. The serpent is not a beast to be slain, but the very source of the oracular power, and it wants her. The question that remained was, did Theon choose to accept this terrifying connection, or was the choice never hers to begin with? Theon's initial terror gives way to a chilling sense of communion. The rhythmic thrumming she once perceived as a simple vibration now resolves into a chorus of voices, ancient and resonant, a choir of geological memory. She realizes that the mountain is not just a rock formation, it is a living archive. Its stone heart beats with the echoes of every event that has ever transpired upon it. You stand there beside her, feeling a strange resonance in the very ground beneath your feet. You sense not just the history of mankind, but the deeper, more profound history of the earth itself, its cataclysms, and its quiet, patient growth. This is the forbidden knowledge. The oracle's power isn't a gift from a god, but a direct channel to the planet's consciousness, a chthonic memory so vast it threatens to unspool your own mind. Theon, the first Pythia, becomes the conduit. The nascent oracle begins to understand the unsettling truth. The seismic activity in the region is directly tied to the clarity of her visions. A subtle tremor, barely perceptible to others, feels to her like a shout from the underworld. Stronger quake, one that sends villagers running in fear, is for her a grand symphony of prophecy, the earth's full voice bellowing forth its secrets. A famous historical fact about Delphi is its location on a geological fault line, a place where tectonic plates are constantly shifting. What historians have long attributed to coincidence, Theon experiences as the very mechanism of her power. The divine fumes that were said to rise from a chasm, which intoxicated the Pythia, were in fact a mix of gases, primarily ethylene and benzene, released during minor seismic events. This quirky scientific detail wasn't a product of Apollo's magic, but a natural, yet highly intoxicating geological phenomenon. Theon's body and mind are slowly becoming one with the mountain's strange metabolism. She no longer needs to seek out the fissure. The whispers find her wherever she goes, the murmuring of stones and the creaking of bedrock, an ever-present hum in her consciousness. Her first prophecy is not a grand poetic pronouncement about a hero's fate, but a terrifying warning to her small village. She tells them, in a voice not entirely her own, that a particular stretch of farmland will soon be consumed by a mudslide, a prediction that seems to defy logic. The villagers, skeptical at first, are stunned when a sudden localized downpour causes the very land she spoke of to slide away, taking with it a small, forgotten shrine. Theon's words were not divined from the heavens, but extracted from the earth's own memory of past deluge and future erosion. Her visions are raw, visceral, and unadorned by a divine metaphor. She sees the future not as a preordained fate, but as a series of geological certainties. She sees the subtle shift of the ground that will cause a wall to crumble, the slow buildup of pressure that will cause a rock to split. This is not the clean, poetic foresight of a god, but the messy, terrifying knowledge of the earth, and it is almost unbearable. But the question that haunted her most was this: if the earth knew its own future with such chilling certainty, could it also know the future of all who walked upon it? And if so, what did that mean for the free will of humanity? Theon, now officially designated as the Pythia, the first of her kind, finds herself increasingly isolated. The villagers, once her friends, now look upon her with a mixture of awe and fear. They bring her offerings, not of gratitude, but of supplication, seeking to avert the inevitable future she sees. The price of this pure, unfiltered knowledge is her humanity. She can no longer have a simple conversation. Every word she hears is layered with 100 echoes of what has been and what will be. When a man asks her a question about his harvest, she doesn't just see his fields. She sees the dust his bones will become, the slow decay of his barn, the unspooling of his family line. This is the profound psychological toll of the oracle's burden. She is a living nexus of time, and the weight of that truth is crushing. There's a mainstream historical fact often overlooked about the early Pythias. Unlike the later, more famous oracles who were revered and given all manner of privileges, the first priestesses were often from poor, rural families. They were not highly educated or politically connected. This was a deliberate choice. The raw, unfiltered knowledge of the earth was so powerful, it would have shattered a more complex, educated mind. The gods, or rather, the forces that shaped the oracle, acquired a blank slate, an empty vessel, to be filled with the earth's ancient wisdom. Theon's simple pastoral mind was the perfect receptacle. But her simplicity was also her vulnerability. She had no intellectual defenses, no philosophical framework to process the profound and disturbing truth she was being shown. The visions came to her not as abstract ideas, but as visceral, sensory assaults. A prophecy of a coming drought was not just a piece of information. It was the sensation of her own throat cracking with thirst, the feeling of the sun baking the life from her skin. A quirky detail about the early rituals reveals a desperate attempt to mitigate this psychological breakdown. The priestesses were given a specific, bitter tea made from the leaves of the Daphne tree, the same tree Apollo was said to have pursued a nymph into. But the purpose of this tea was not to enhance the vision. It was a sedative. was meant to dull the edge of the constant, overwhelming sensory input. To make the visions less of a torrent and more of a manageable stream, it was a crude form of mental anesthesia, a grim acknowledgement that the truth, when delivered raw, was a poison. Theon, in her solitude, begins to see the irony. People come to her for a clear path for an easy answer, but the knowledge she possesses only shows her the terrifying web of interconnected causality. A web in which every choice is both a cause and a consequence, and there is no true escape. She realizes that the oracle's prophecies, far from being definitive, are merely snapshots of a chaotic, ever-shifting reality, and she is merely a mirror reflecting its grim visage. But the question that gnawed at her, and that now gnaws at you, is this. Was this a form of divine guidance, or a cosmic cruelty? Was the knowledge bestowed upon her for the benefit of humanity, or for the grim amusement of a power that saw mortals as little more than intricate patterns in the dust? As the Oracle of Delphi gains prominence, the simple stone where Theon first communed with the earth is replaced by a magnificent temple, a testament to the power of foresight and the hubris of man. Central to this new sanctuary is a bizarre and ancient artifact, the golden tripod. The tripod, a three-legged cauldron stand, becomes the symbol of the oracle's power, the very seat upon which the Pythia delivers her prophecies. Mainstream accounts describe it as a sacred relic, a gift from Apollo himself. But you, standing in the silent sanctum, now know the truth. You can see the dark energies that swirl around it, the subtle, terrifying hum that emanates not from a god's grace, but from a different, far older source. The tripod is not a gift. It is a cage. A bizarre detail about this golden tripod reveals its true, grim function. Ancient texts, often considered apocryphal, hint that the tripod was not made of simple gold, but was somehow forged from the crystallized essence of the serpent python's blood. Its molten consciousness cooled and hardened into a vessel. The tripod wasn't merely a seat, it was a psychological amplifier. When the Pythia sat upon it, the tripod didn't just elevate her physically, it served as a conduit. It's concentrating the thonic energies of the earth and the seeping essence of Python-esque consciousness directly into her mind. The grooves and ornate carvings weren't decorations. They were a form of sigil, a grim circuit board designed to channel and contain the raw, chaotic power that would otherwise have shattered the Pythia's sanity in an instant. This quirky detail reveals the horrifying nature of the oracle's power. It was not a gentle, divine whisper, but a concentrated blast of forbidden knowledge that required a complex apparatus to manage. The Pythia wasn't a vessel.
Ow.
She was a pressure valve, and the tripod was the mechanism that prevented the pressure from blowing her apart entirely. As new priestesses are chosen and trained, they learn not just the art of prophecy, but the harrowing art of psychological endurance. They are taught to focus on the tripod's cold, smooth surface, to use its geometry as a mental anchor against the rising tide of information. They are told that the tripod is their protector, their link to Apollo, their salvation. But in the quiet hours, when the supplicants are gone and the temple is shrouded in shadow, the Pythia feels the tripod for what it truly is, an inescapable chain. It binds her to the earth and to the lingering consciousness of the serpent. A consciousness that is not malicious, but hungry. It consumes her thoughts, her memories, her dreams. It doesn't offer visions, steals them from her, reshaping them into the cryptic, often terrifying riddles that will be delivered to the next day's hero or king. The question that hangs in the air thick as the vapor from the chasm is this: is the golden tripod a tool of divine benevolence, or was it a form of sophisticated psychological torture, a cage designed to keep a powerful but volatile force from breaking free? The myth of Apollo's glorious victory over the serpent Python is one of the most famous Greek legends. Mainstream historical accounts tell us that Apollo, a young, radiant god, slays the monstrous serpent that guarded the sacred site of Delphi, purifying it with his divine power and claiming the sanctuary as his own. But as you listen to the echoes of the mountain, a different, far more unsettling truth comes to light. The defeat of Python was not an extermination, it was a transference. The serpentine essence, a primordial consciousness of the earth itself, was not destroyed. It was merely forced to retreat, to coil itself deep within the chthonic heart of the mountain, its influence seeping through the stone and soil like a powerful, living echo. This is the hidden truth behind the oracle's power. The Pythia's visions are not gifts from the Olympian god of light, but a channel to the ancient earthbound mind of the serpent. Apollo's victory was not a conquest, but a containment. 8. He didn't destroy Python. He domesticated it, capturing its raw power and molding it into a usable form, a predictable source of foresight. Think of it as a great wild river. Apollo didn't make the river disappear. He built a dam, a series of locks and channels, to control its flow and use its power to turn the wheels of his own grand design. A quirky, mythological detail supports this idea. The priestesses of Delphi were known as the Pythia, a name derived directly from Python. This isn't a mere tribute. It's a grim acknowledgement of the true source of their power. The Pythia is not the priestess of Apollo. She is the priestess of Python, a vessel for its residual potent consciousness. The oracle's prophecies, therefore, are not expressions of Apollo's will, but the fragmented, often cryptic, and psychologically draining echoes of the serpent's mind. The visions are cold, amoral, and vast, much like the earth itself. They see not in terms of good and evil, but in terms of cause and effect of geological time and inexorable change. The Pythia's mind is not just receiving divine information. It is struggling to translate the language of a primordial being, a being that understands nothing of human love, loss, or ambition. This psychological burden is the source of the Pythia's famous babbling and frenzied state. She isn't speaking in tongues. She is trying to make sense of a consciousness that is millions of years old, a mind that perceives time not as a linear progression, but as a vast, simultaneous moment. But the terrifying question that lingers is this: if Apollo did not destroy the serpent, but merely contained it, what was to stop Python's ancient, patient mind from eventually breaking free and reclaiming its power entirely? The myth of the divine fumes, the ethereal breath of Apollo, is one of the most romanticized parts of the oracle's tale. Mainstream history and mythology tell us that a sweet-smelling vapor rising from a chasm would intoxicate the Pythia, filling her with divine inspiration and allowing her to see the future. But the reality is far more terrifying and far less divine. The fumes were indeed real, but they were not the sweet breath of a god. They were a hallucinogenic gas that bound the priestess to the earth, a cocktail of natural vapors that served a specific psychological purpose. A historical fact noted by scholars is the presence of ethylene gas, a potent hallucinogen, at the site of the ancient temple. This gas, likely seeping from geological fissures, would induce a trance-like state, a powerful, altered consciousness. But the Pythia wasn't just inhaling a gas. She was absorbing a part of the earth itself. This is the psychological torment. The gas, a quirky detail of the oracle's legend, didn't just give her visions. It made her mind a literal extension of the mountain's consciousness. She felt the slow grinding of tectonic plates as a dull ache in her bones. She tasted the mineral composition of the rock, the metallic temps of iron, and the chalky dryness of limestone on her tongue. Her own personal memories and thoughts began to blur and bleed into the vast, impersonal memory of the earth. She would recall a moment from her childhood, a simple picnic by a stream, and suddenly, the memory would be layered with the earth's memory of that same stream. The millions of years of its slow erosion, the silent passage of 100 generations of animals drinking from its banks, the geological forces that carved its path. The priestess realizes with dawning horror that she is not a vessel for Apollo, but a prisoner of the earth.
Ow.
The gas doesn't just grant her visions, it slowly erodes her own sense of self, replacing it with the cold, indifferent consciousness of the planet. She feels her mind, once a distinct and separate entity, dissolving, becoming a part of the vast collective unconscious of the chthonic power beneath her feet. The prophecies she delivers are not revelations from a god, but the fragmented, often terrifying stream of consciousness of a planet that has no sense of human joy or sorrow. Only the brutal, uncaring logic of geology and time. She is becoming less human and more rock. The question that haunted every Pythia was this: was the loss of self the price of power? Or was it the ultimate, most insidious form of imprisonment? And if she could no longer distinguish her own thoughts from the mountains, how could she ever be truly free? The constant influx of raw, unfiltered information and the slow erosion of the self takes a devastating psychological toll on the priestesses. Mainstream historical fact, often presented as a sign of their spiritual devotion, is the celibacy of the Pythia. It was seen as a way to maintain their purity and focus on their divine role. But you, standing in the silent sanctum, now understand the more sinister reason. The priestesses were kept celibate, not to maintain purity, but to sever their last remaining ties to the mortal world. A family, a partner, a child, these were anchors to a human existence that the oracle's power would not tolerate. They were a threat to the complete psychological dissolution required to become a perfect conduit. The celibacy was a form of isolation, a deliberate act to make the Pythia's mind a blank canvas, devoid of human attachments. You watch as a priestess, her name forgotten to history, suffers a profound psychological breakdown. She begins to hallucinate not just visions of the future, but visions of her own past, so vivid they feel more real than her present reality. She sees herself as a young girl, playing in a field, but in the vision. The field is choked with the skeletal remains of the people who will one day walk there. She sees the faces of her family, but their features are distorted, their eyes hollow with the knowledge of their own future deaths, which she now possesses. This psychological torment is a quirky detail that was often explained away as divine madness, but was in fact a form of severe depersonalization. Her mind is fracturing, unable to reconcile the human sense of self with the vast impersonal consciousness of the earth. She begins to speak in a fragmented, unintelligible language, not the babbling of prophecy, but the desperate, broken words of a mind that has been shattered. Scribes, who are meant to interpret her words, cannot make sense of it. This psychological unraveling is a terrifying departure from the myth of the wise, tranquil oracle. It is a grim reality of a human mind pushed far past its breaking point. She screams not prophecies of war or peace, but the chilling, guttural pleas of a soul that has been subsumed. But the most terrifying question that remains is this: if the Pythia's sanity was the price of her knowledge, what kind of information could possibly be worth such a devastating cost? And could the people who came to her for answers ever truly trust a prophecy from a mind that had been so utterly destroyed? Among the countless seekers who came to the Oracle of Delphi, there is a historical anomaly that few historians dare to explore. It's the tale of a man who came not to ask a question, but to deliberately avoid one. He was a simple farmer, haunted by a dream that foretold his death. If he ever sought out the oracle's wisdom, this is a mainstream historical fact often noted in the margins of ancient texts, a bizarre footnote to the grand epic of heroes and kings. This man, unlike all others, did not kneel. He simply stood at the threshold of the temple, silent. The priests and scribes were baffled. This was an unprecedented act. The oracle existed to be questioned, to provide answers that would shape destiny. But the man simply refused to engage in the ritual. The oracle, a Pythia, now hollowed out by her burdens, felt his presence like a stone in a vast, empty river. He was a blank space in her vision, a place where the intricate web of causality simply stopped. This was a direct assault on the very nature of her power, which relied on the act of questioning to unlock the future. A quirky detail of this encounter is that the Pythia, in her frustration, began to speak unprompted, a stream of consciousness that was utterly devoid of meaning. It was not a prophecy, but a broken litany of geological facts. The composition of the limestone is a slow creep of a distant glacier, the age of a particular grain of sand. This was the oracle's raw, unchanneled mind, a mind that had no context for human emotion or purpose. It was a terrifying glimpse into the abyss of her knowledge, a world without meaning. The man, sensing this, simply walked away, leaving the priests to their bewilderment. His act was a profound rebellion, a refusal to participate in the game of fate. He understood, instinctively, that the oracle's power lay not in its ability to see the future, but in its ability to force people to choose a path, to create the future by their very act of asking. The prophecies were a psychological trap. By seeking an answer, the supplicant became a pawn in a cosmic game, their free will subtly eroded by the weight of a seemingly inevitable destiny. But the man who refused to ask had, by his very refusal, created a future that was truly his own, unwritten and unpredictable. The question that hangs in the air, thick with the silence he left behind, is this: was the greatest wisdom of the oracle not in the answers it gave, but in the questions it compelled people to ask? The Temple of Apollo at Delphi was a marvel of ancient architecture, a grand structure built into the side of the mountain. Mainstream historical fact tells us that its design was a tribute to the god's glory, a beautiful and sacred space for his divine pronouncements. But you, standing in the silent sanctum, now see it for what it truly is: a psychological trap, an architectural manifestation of the oracle's forbidden knowledge. The temple was not designed to be open and welcoming. It was designed to be claustrophobic, to create a sense of compression and isolation that would enhance the Pythia's connection to the chthonic forces below. A quirky architectural detail noted by archaeologists is the narrow, winding passageway that led to the inner sanctum. It was a tight, constricted space, forcing the supplicant and the priestess to move slowly in single file. The walls were not smooth. They were rough-hewn stone, a tactile reminder of the mountain's raw, unyielding nature. This was a deliberate design choice, a form of sensory deprivation that prepared the supplicant for the profound psychological experience to come. It was a physical representation of the oracle's power, a claustrophobic descent into the earth's own mind. The sanctum itself was a small, windowless chamber, a place where the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy presence of the unblinking earth. There was no escape, no easy way out. The design of the temple wasn't a tribute to a god. It was a cage for a human soul, a vessel designed to contain and control the volatile power of the earth. The most terrifying part of this architectural quirk is the fact that the temple's design also served to contain the Pythia herself. She was not allowed to leave the sanctum freely. The priests would move her in and out, like a sacred artifact, a living conduit to be used and put away. She was a psychological prisoner in a literal cage. Her world was a 24/7 sensory assault, with no way to escape the constant hum of the earth. Even when she was not on the tripod, the stones around her whispered secrets. The walls hummed with the slow grind of geological time. The sanctuary was not a place of solace. It was a place of permanent, unceasing burden. The question that resonates in the hushed, cavernous halls of the temple is this: did the Pythia, in her isolation, ever truly know if her visions were real? Or if they were just the final, terrifying manifestation of her own psychological torment, a hallucination brought on by her own imprisonment? The riddle of the Sphinx is a cornerstone of Greek mythology, a famous legend about a monstrous creature that would devour anyone who could not solve her cryptic question. Mainstream historical fact and myth tell us that Oedipus, the clever hero, solved the riddle, and in doing so, freed the city of Thebes from the Sphinx's reign of terror. But as you delve deeper into the forbidden knowledge of the oracle, you discover a strange and unsettling connection between the Sphinx and the prophecies of Delphi. The oracle's prophecies were not always the disjointed babble of a Pythia in a trance. They were often delivered as highly specific and often cruel riddles. The Sphinx's riddle was a grotesque, singular manifestation of the same psychological trick that the oracle used every day. A quirky detail that ties these two legends together is the etymology of the word sphinx. It comes from the Greek verb sphingene, which means to bind or to squeeze. The Sphinx did not just ask a question. She psychologically bound her victims to a paradox, squeezing their minds until they broke. This is precisely what the oracle's prophecies did. They were not designed to be easily solved. They were designed to force the supplicant into a state of cognitive dissonance, to make them confront a reality that was both true and impossible at the same time. The famous prophecy to King Croesus, that if he went to war against the Persians, a great empire would fall, is a perfect example. It was true, and it was a lie, and it was a puzzle, and it was a trap. Croesus thought he had solved it, but he was merely ensnared by the same trick that the Sphinx used on her victims. The oracle's knowledge, therefore, was not a clear path to the future, but a psychological labyrinth. The prophecies were designed to be interpreted, but every interpretation was just another layer of the riddle. The Pythia bound to the earth, and the serpent's consciousness would see 100 possible futures, 1,000 interlocking causalities. Her riddles were not malicious. but a desperate attempt to express the incomprehensible complexity of the truth. She wasn't just giving a prophecy, she was giving a piece of a vast, unfinishable puzzle, forcing the supplicant to complete the picture with their own choices, and in doing so, become complicit in their own fate. The question that remains is this: was Oedipus's triumph over the Sphinx a victory, or was it merely the first step on his tragic journey? A journey that had been set in motion by a force that understood the power of a riddle better than any mortal ever could. The story of the hero who comes to the oracle is a timeless archetype in Greek mythology, a mainstream historical fact woven into the fabric of countless legends. The hero, often on a quest of profound importance, seeks divine guidance, a clear path to victory. But the oracle, bound to the earth and the cruel paradox of its forbidden knowledge, gives them something far more devastating, a psychologically crippling prophecy that unravels their own sense of self. The hero is given a prophecy that is true, but it is a truth so terrible it makes their victory feel hollow, their triumph a prelude to a greater tragedy. This is the profound psychological burden of the oracle's wisdom. A quirky detail that was often left out of the grand retellings of these tales is the physical reaction of the heroes. Ancient texts, often considered too mundane to include, describe a strange physiological response. The hero, upon hearing the prophecy, would not just feel despair. They would feel a physical sensation of cold, a chilling realization that a part of their soul had been stolen, replaced with the cold, unfeeling truth of their future. Their skin would grow clammy, their vision would blur. They would often leave the temple not with a sense of purpose, but with a profound and disorienting sense of existential dread. They had a map to victory, but it was a map that showed them the exact location of their own eventual ruin. The oracle's advice wasn't a gift. It was a psychological weapon. It did not guide the hero. It trapped them. The prophecy to Oedipus, that he would kill his father and marry his mother, is a classic example. It was a truth so devastating that it made his every choice, his every action, an unwitting step toward his own destruction. It wasn't just a prophecy of the future. It was a prophecy that shaped the present, forcing him into a tragic dance with a destiny he desperately tried to outrun. The oracle's knowledge wasn't about guiding a hero to a happy ending. It was about demonstrating the chilling futility of fighting against a future that has already been revealed. But the question that remains, thick as the unholy air of the sanctum, is this: did the oracle give these prophecies out of cruelty? Or was it a desperate final warning to the hero to turn back? A warning that, in the end, no one was ever able to heed. You are walking now, not in the sunlit halls of the temple, but in the dark, forgotten spaces beneath it. A mainstream historical fact often discussed in hushed tones by archaeologists is the existence of a labyrinthine network of tunnels beneath the Temple of Apollo. These tunnels, often dismissed as mundane service passages or ancient drainage systems, hint at a far more sinister purpose. They lead not to the surface, but deeper into the earth, into the suffocating darkness of the mountain's core. They are a physical manifestation of the oracle's true chthonic origin. This is the forbidden knowledge. The temple was built on a lie, but the passages beneath it tell the truth of a forgotten deity, an entity that predates the very concept of the Olympians. A quirky detail about these subterranean tunnels is that ancient writings sometimes refer to them not as tunnels, but as the veins of Gaia. The Greeks believed Gaia, the earth itself, was a living, breathing deity. This isn't just a metaphor, it's a terrifying reality. The tunnels were not just a way to get from one place to another. They were a way to commune with the mountain's living essence. The air down here is different. It's thick and heavy, smelling not of fresh stone, but of something ancient and moist, like decaying moss and cold, wet earth. The sound of your own footsteps is swallowed by a profound silence, a silence so complete it feels like a presence. And you can feel the rhythmic thrumming of the earth, a sound that is both a heartbeat and a geological tremor, a constant reminder of the serpent's sleeping consciousness. The tunnels are not empty. They are decorated not with the iconography of Apollo, but with crude, primitive carvings of a great serpent, coiled around the very heart of the mountain. These are not symbols of Python, but of a forgotten, more ancient deity, primordial being that existed long before the Olympians ever rose to power. The Oracle of Delphi, therefore, was not the voice of Apollo, but the voice of this forgotten, chthonic god. Apollo's temple, his golden tripod, his priests, and his elaborate rituals were all just a magnificent and terrifying layer of lies, a grand illusion built to hide the dark, brutal truth. He didn't just contain the serpent, usurped its power, rebranding its ancient whispers as his own divine word. The question that echoes in the dark, winding passages is this: what happened to this older, more powerful deity, and what happens to a god that has been forgotten? Its power stolen, and its name erased from history? The Oracle of Delphi is often seen as a simple vessel for a god's will, a straightforward transaction of question and answer. But as you delve deeper into its hidden history, you realize that the relationship between Apollo and the Oracle is far more complex and far more sinister. It is not a partnership, but a game. A mainstream historical fact that supports this is the occasional, but documented, instances where the Pythia's prophecies directly contradicted Apollo's other holy sites or even his own priests. This was not a mistake. It was a deliberate act, a subtle move in a larger, more intricate game. Apollo and the Oracle were revealed to be playing a deeper, more complicated game with mortals, and we, the supplicants, were merely their pawns. A quirky detail that brings this to light is a lesser-known mythological story about Apollo's sacred laurel tree. The laurel was not just a symbol of his divine status. It was a psychological weapon. Apollo would often whisper prophecies into the leaves of the tree, creating a subtle, almost imperceptible psychic link to the Pythia. The Pythia, in turn, would feel a strange compulsion to use the leaves in her ritual, to chew on them, or to crush them in her hands. Not for divine inspiration, but as a way to receive Apollo's cryptic commands. The oracle's prophecies, therefore, were not always the raw, unfiltered knowledge of the earth, but a strange, terrifying blend of the earth's brutal truth and Apollo's subtle, often contradictory manipulation. He was not just using the Pythia. He was using her to play a psychological game with his own followers, testing their faith and their loyalty. You feel a chilling realization. Apollo didn't just contain the serpent's power, he weaponized it. He used the oracle's forbidden knowledge of the future as a tool to test the limits of human faith and free will. He would give a hero a partial truth from the earth, and then watch as the hero, in their desperation to control their fate, would make choices that would lead to their downfall. It was a game of cosmic cruelty, a divine experiment in psychological torment. The oracle wasn't a source of wisdom. It was a trap, a mechanism designed to demonstrate the terrifying futility of fighting a future that a god had already revealed. The question that hangs in the air, thick with the scent of laurel leaves and human desperation, is this: if the gods played with mortals' fates as if they were nothing more than a game, what was the point of human ambition, of human love, of human struggle? The prophecies of the oracle were not delivered in a neat, poetic form. A mainstream historical fact, well documented by ancient writers, is that the Pythia's pronouncements were often a jumbled, frenzied stream of consciousness, a chaotic torrent of images, sounds, and fragmented words. The responsibility for translating this chaos into a coherent, usable prophecy fell to the scribes, a group of high-ranking priests who stood by the Pythia's side. But you, listening to the echoes in the silent sanctum, realized their role was far more insidious. They were not just interpreters. They were editors. They were the arbiters of truth, the final filter between the raw, terrifying knowledge of the earth and the polished, politicized version that was delivered to the supplicants. A quirky detail about these scribes is their bizarre and meticulous record-keeping. They would record not just the words of the Pythia, but the inflection of her voice, tremor in her hands, the sweat on her brow. They had a complex system of notation to capture the full psychological state of the priestess, a detail that was dismissed by later historians as mere bureaucratic pedantry. But you realize it was a tool for manipulation. They were not just interpreting the prophecy, they were editing it, shaping it to fit the needs of the political elite, to serve the agenda of powerful kings and corrupt politicians. They could take a Pythia's guttural warning of an impending ecological disaster and reframe it as a sign of divine disfavor, a justification for a new war. They could take a fragmented vision of a man's tragic, inevitable death and shape it into a heroic, self-sacrificing act. This echo chamber of truth is the most terrifying part of the oracle's legacy. The scribes didn't just translate the prophecies. They censored them, sanitized them, and turned them into a tool of social and political control. The oracle's true raw knowledge was too dangerous, too destabilizing to be released to the public. It would have revealed the uncomfortable truth that the future was not a linear path, but a chaotic, unpredictable web of cause and effect, and that the gods were not benevolent guides, but cosmic manipulators. The scribes were the gatekeepers of this forbidden knowledge. They created the myth of the oracle as a wise, all-knowing force, when in reality, it was a broken, traumatized human being whose words were being co-opted for their own selfish ends. The question that lingers in the air thick with the scent of old parchment and hidden lies is this: if the oracle's prophecies were merely edited versions of the truth, could any seeker who came to Delphi ever truly trust what they were being told? The oracle was celebrated for its unwavering foresight, for its ability to see into the future with chilling accuracy. This is a mainstream historical fact, a pillar of ancient faith. A Jew, listening to the whispered secrets of the mountain, now understand the lie at the heart of this reputation. The Pythia did not have unlimited visions. Her prophecies were not a clear, complete tapestry of what was to come. They were fragmented. Fleeting glimpses of a reality so vast and terrifying that her human mind could only grasp a few pieces at a time. The Pythia often fabricated parts of her prophecies, not out of malice, but out of a profound and desperate need to make sense of the chaos. She had to fill in the gaps. A quirky detail that supports this is the presence of a bizarre ritual that took place before a supplicant ever saw the Pythia. The priests would ask the supplicant a series of seemingly mundane and often repetitive questions about their lives, their journeys, their motivations. They claimed this was to prepare the supplicant for the ritual, but you now realize it was a crude form of information gathering. The priests and scribes would take this information and feed it to the Pythia, giving her the raw material she needed to construct a believable prophecy. She wasn't seeing the future. She was extrapolating a plausible future from the facts she had been given. She was a master improviser, a psychological artist who could weave a tapestry of fate from a few threads of truth. This is the psychological reality of the Pythia's power. She was not a divine vessel, but a human mind under immense pressure, forced to create the illusion of foresight. The prophecies were a performance, a grand deception built on a few scattered pieces of genuine but utterly meaningless knowledge from the earth. When she gave King Croesus his famous prophecy, she didn't see a vision of a great empire falling. She felt the raw, geological certainty of an impending conflict, and from that feeling her human mind constructed a story, a riddle that would become a tragic truth. But the most terrifying question of all is this: if the Pythia herself was a part of the deception, if her prophecies were a blend of real and fabricated knowledge, how could anyone ever truly know the difference? And what kind of psychological burden must it be to know that you are a vessel not just for the truth, but for an elaborate and dangerous lie? The Pythia was not a vessel for Apollo, but a prisoner of the sanctuary. This is the chilling psychological truth that began to dawn on every priestess who inhabited the inner sanctum of Delphi. A mainstream historical fact is the Pythia's complete dependence on the temple for her every need: food, shelter, even her most basic human contact was mediated by the priests. This was not a sign of divine care. It was a form of total control, a mechanism to ensure her mind was completely severed from the outside world. She had no identity outside of her role as the oracle, a terrifying reality that left her with no recourse, no escape. A quirky detail that brings this to light is the bizarre ritual of sacred feeding. Ancient texts sometimes mention a specific, bland, and nutrient-poor diet the Pythia was forced to consume. This wasn't just a religious fast, it was a psychological tactic. The priests would deliberately undernourish the Pythia, causing a state of constant low-grade physical and mental duress. This, combined with the hallucinogenic gases and the psychological torment of her visions, was designed to keep her in a perpetually weakened, dependent state. She was a bird in a golden cage, a human soul in a temple that was more a prison than a sanctuary. The temple, with its beautiful, ornate carvings and its grand statues of Apollo, was nothing more than a magnificent facade for a place of psychological and physical torture. The Pythia's final, crushing realization was that she was not a tool of a god, but a pawn in a game between a god and a forgotten chthonic power. Apollo's magnificent temple was a lie, a cover-up for a darker, more ancient power. She was a human sacrifice, a living conduit to a power that was slowly consuming her from the inside out. The question that remains heavy with the weight of her imprisonment is this: if the oracle's prophecies were a result of her confinement, a psychological breakdown born of her own suffering, could any truth she spoke ever truly be trusted? Or was she, in her final moments of lucidity, merely a conduit for her own despair? The Oracle of Delphi was a source of wisdom, but that wisdom came with a terrifying paradox. This is a mainstream historical fact, woven into the very fabric of Greek mythology and drama. The knowledge of the future creates a paradox that traps the seeker, a psychological labyrinth from which there is no escape. The prophecy itself, by its very existence, alters the future it seeks to reveal, creating a self-fulfilling or self-negating loop that ensnares the mortal mind. The oracle did not just provide a truth, it created a paradox that would shatter the seeker's sense of free will. A quirky detail that highlights this is the legend of the Pythia's silent laughter. Ancient texts, often considered apocryphal, describe a strange silent convulsion of the priestess's body after she delivered a particularly devastating prophecy. It was not a sound, but a tremor, a silent fit of amusement. The Pythia was not laughing at the supplicant's misfortune. She was laughing at the cosmic irony of the paradox she had just created. She knew that the hero who had come to her seeking a clear path had just been given a truth that would force them to make a choice, and that very choice would lead them to the tragic conclusion that she had just foretold. It was a cosmic joke, a profound commentary on the futility of human ambition in the face of a future that had already been set in motion by the very act of trying to change it. The psychological torment of this paradox is the oracle's ultimate legacy. The seeker, upon hearing the prophecy, is trapped. They can either try to outrun their fate, and in doing so unwittingly fulfill it, or they can resign themselves to their destiny, and in doing so become a passive victim of a future that they were meant to create. The oracle's knowledge wasn't a gift, it was a curse. It showed the seeker a terrifying truth, and then watched as they tried to outrun it, their every frantic step only bringing them closer to their inevitable doom. Right. The question that haunts every mind that has ever considered the oracle is this: if knowing the future only leads to a tragic paradox, is it better to be ignorant? Is the forbidden knowledge of the oracle the most dangerous truth of all? A truth that makes a mockery of all human hope and effort? The Oracle of Delphi was built on a site of profound geological and historical significance. Mainstream historical fact often overlooked is the existence of the so-called Whispering Stones, a series of large, oddly shaped rocks scattered around the sacred site. These stones, dismissed by historians as mere geological formations, were the subject of a powerful local legend, the belief that they carried ancient secrets and the echoes of the past. The people of Delphi believed that if you pressed your ear to the stones, you could hear the faint, disembodied whispers of heroes and kings who had sought the oracle's wisdom. This isn't just a quirky local legend. It's a terrifying glimpse into the true nature of the forbidden knowledge. The stones, you realize, were not just rocks. They were a form of natural memory. The chthonic power of the serpent, the vast earthbound consciousness that permeated the ground, had an eerie and unsettling ability to absorb and retain the emotional and psychological imprints of those who stood upon it. The whispers were not a divine sign. They were a form of psychological residue, a ghostly echo of the desperation, hope, and despair of the countless souls who had come to the oracle for answers. You stand there, a cold dread washing over you, as you feel the weight of 1,000 unresolved fates, 1,000 shattered hopes, 1,000 tragic choices. The stones are not just silent witnesses. They are a living archive of human suffering. This bizarre detail reveals the ultimate truth of the oracle's power. It didn't just see the future. It was a living, breathing archive of the past. It wasn't just a place of prophecy. It was a place where the emotional weight of history was so profound it could be felt, heard and absorbed by those who were sensitive enough to the earth's vibrations. The oracle's knowledge, therefore, wasn't just a vision of what was to come. It was a horrifyingly complete picture of what had been, what was, and what would be, all at once. The question that rings out in the silence of the sacred site is this: if the stones themselves remember the pain and suffering of the past, what kind of psychological terror did the Pythia, the ultimate conduit for that knowledge, have to endure every single day? Apollo, the magnificent god of light and prophecy, is celebrated as a deity of reason and order. This is a mainstream historical fact, a core tenet of Greek mythology. But as you delve into the forbidden knowledge of the oracle, you discover a strange and unsettling quirk, a bizarre detail that hints at a darker, more complex personality. Apollo had an unusual obsession with a specific kind of laurel leaf, not just for its symbolic value, but for a bizarre, almost ritualistic purpose. The laurel was not just a tribute to his divine status. It was a psychological tool, a subtle way to bind the oracle to his will. The laurel, a symbol of prophecy, was also a subtle, almost imperceptible poison. A quirky detail, often dismissed as poetic fancy, is the description of the Pythia's bizarre, unnatural pallor. Ancient texts sometimes describe the Pythia as having a sickly, greenish tint to her skin, a detail that was attributed to her proximity to the gods. But you now realize it was a physical manifestation of her slow poisoning. The laurel leaves, which she was compelled to handle and sometimes chew on, contained trace amounts of toxins that, over time, would cause a subtle but debilitating neurological damage. This was not a side effect of divine communion. It was a deliberate act, a way to ensure the Pythia's mind was pliable, her body weak, and her spirit utterly dependent on the god who she was told was her master. The laurel was a shackle, a quiet, almost imperceptible form of control. This strange obsession reveals the terrifying truth about Apollo. He was not just a benevolent god of prophecy. He was a cosmic manipulator, a master of psychological warfare. He didn't need to force the Pythia to do his will, simply needed to make her body and mind so weak that his will would feel like a divine and welcome command. The oracle's visions were not just a blend of the Earth's knowledge and his own cryptic manipulation. They were a product of a mind that had been slowly, methodically poisoned to human, a soul that had been reduced to a state of utter dependency. The question that lingers in the air, thick with the scent of laurel, is this: was Apollo's love for the laurel a sign of his devotion to prophecy, or was it a sign of a dark narcissistic cruelty, a desire to have a beautiful but broken human being as his personal living puppet? The Oracle of Delphi was the most powerful voice of the ancient world. This is a mainstream historical fact. But as you continue to listen, you feel a presence that is not Apollo and not the serpent. There is an unseen listener, a forgotten deity observing the oracle's prophecies, a quiet, almost imperceptible force that has been watching the grand game of Apollo and Python play out for millennia. This is the forbidden knowledge. A quirky detail in some obscure ancient texts mentions a small, almost invisible statue of a minor deity in the deepest, most inaccessible part of the temple, a statue of a god with no name, a face made of pure, unblemished stone. This statue was not a tribute. It was a testament to a presence, a witness to the oracle's long, slow descent into madness and control. This is the chilling psychological truth. The oracle's power was not just a result of the Earth's raw knowledge and Apollo's manipulation. It was a three-way conversation, a cosmic dialogue between a human, a god, and a force that had been forgotten by history. This forgotten deity was not malevolent or benevolent. It was a detached observer, a quiet, unblinking eye that witnessed the whole tragic drama unfold. It saw the heroes come and go, the kings rise and fall, the Pythia's sanity crumble under the weight of her burden. Its presence was a constant reminder that the grand drama of Greek mythology was not just a conflict between good and evil, but a far more complex and unsettling reality, a reality where some powers simply watched with no interest in the outcome, only in the process. The presence of this unseen listener changes everything. It means that the oracle's prophecies were not just for the benefit of the supplicant, or for the amusement of Apollo. They were a form of entertainment for a silent, ancient being that had nothing but time. The oracle's suffering, her psychological torment, her slow descent into madness, was all a spectacle for a being that had long since grown tired of the petty squabbles of gods and mortals. The question that lingers heavy with the weight of eternity is this: If the oracle's entire purpose was to serve as a form of cosmic entertainment for a forgotten god, what does that say about the nature of our own free will and the grand design of the universe? The end of the Oracle of Delphi is a mainstream historical fact. The final Pythia, her name lost to history, delivers a prophecy not about the future of an empire, but about the nature of truth itself. She is old, her body and mind worn out by decades of communion with the earth and the cruel manipulation of a god. The final prophecy is not a riddle, but a chilling, clear statement that shatters the very foundation of the oracle's power. It is a terrifying departure from the cryptic, poetic pronouncements of the past, a final act of rebellion from a soul that has been utterly broken. A quirky detail, often dismissed as the ramblings of a madwoman, is her final physical act. She stands up, not in a trance-like state, but with a terrifying lucidity. She walks over to the Omphilus stone, the so-called navel of the world, and places her hand on its smooth, warm surface. There. She then turns to the priests, her eyes clear and filled with a profound and terrible knowledge. She says, not in a mystical voice, but in a voice that is raw and human, "The knowledge you seek is not in the future. It is not in the stars. It is in the earth. It is in the lie you have been telling for 1,000 years. She is not giving a prophecy. She is revealing the forbidden knowledge that has been her prison and her torment. She is telling them that the oracle was never a source of divine wisdom, but a psychological trap, a web of lies built on a foundation of raw, unfeeling geological truth. This is the psychological climax of the oracle's journey. The final Pythia, in her last act, reclaims her humanity. She shatters the illusion of divine authority and reveals the terrible truth that she and all the Pythias before her have been nothing more than psychological prisoners, their lives and their souls consumed by a system built on deception. Her final prophecy is not a prediction of the future, but a statement of truth about the past, a truth so devastating it would shake the very foundations of the Greek world. The question that echoes in the silent, horrified minds of the priests is this: if the oracle's final prophecy was that the oracle was a lie, what was to become of the faith and the empire that had been built upon its word? The final Pythia's prophecy hangs in the air, a devastating truth that no one wants to believe. She does not receive a divine punishment. She simply withers. Her final moments are not of a grand, tragic hero, but of a broken, exhausted human being. This is a mainstream historical fact often brushed aside in the grand narratives of Greek mythology. The Pythia, once a living conduit to the divine, simply collapses. Her final breath is not a last prophetic gasp, but a sigh of profound and utter relief. She is free. Her body, having been a vessel for the earth's consciousness and a puppet for Apollo's will, finally gives out under the crushing weight of her knowledge. She is released from the paradox, from the lie, from the psychological torment that had been her constant companion for her entire life. A quirky detail, often dismissed as folklore, is the way her body changed after her death. The priests, who were accustomed to the Pythia's body being pale and sickly, were stunned to find that her skin, in the moments after her death, seemed to regain a healthy human color. Her hands, once twisted and gnarled by the constant influx of 1,000 visions, seemed to relax, to become a normal human hand. Her face, which had been a mask of profound ancient weariness, finally settled into a look of quiet, peaceful calm. She was a human again, a woman who had been a prisoner for so long that her body had forgotten what it felt like to be her own. The oracle's last breath reveals the true, crushing weight of her knowledge. It was not a gift of foresight, but a burden of unbearable truth. She knew that the future was not a preordained fate, but a chaotic, unpredictable web of choices and consequences. She knew that the gods were not benevolent guides, but cruel, manipulative forces that saw mortals as little more than pawns in a cosmic game. And she knew that her own life, her own suffering, had been nothing more than a part of that game. The question that remains is this: if the oracle's final moments were of peace, did that mean that her entire life had been a living hell? And was the only true wisdom to be found at Delphi the wisdom to know when to let go of the truth and simply be human again? The magnificent facade of the Oracle of Delphi was a lie, but the power beneath it was terrifyingly real. As the final Pythia draws her last breath, the temple is silent. The thanic whispers of the earth seeming to pause in a moment of respect for the human who had finally broken free. The true source of the oracle's power is revealed to be a much older, earthbound entity, a forgotten god that existed long before the Olympians ever rose to power. This is the ultimate, most profound piece of forbidden knowledge. The oracle was not Apollo's, was always and forever the property of a being that had no name. A being whose consciousness was the very stone and soil of the earth itself. A quirky detail from ancient folklore suggests that the original inhabitants of Delphi, before the arrival of the Greeks, worshipped a god of the mountain, a deity that was not personified by a human form, but by the very landscape itself. This was the earthbound entity, a force so ancient and powerful, it did not need a name or a face. It was simply the mountain, and its power was absolute. It did not have intentions or plans or emotions. It was a force of nature, a cosmic consciousness that saw human lives not as a drama, but as a series of geological events, a brief, fleeting shift in the Earth's long, slow history. The oracle's power, therefore, was not a result of divine communication. It was a result of a direct, unfiltered connection to the raw, amoral power of the earth. Apollo did not create the oracle. He merely put his name on it, rebranding a terrifying primal power as his own. He was the most magnificent and brilliant of parasites, a god who had learned to siphon the power of a much older, more powerful being and use it for his own ends. The question that remains thick with the silence of a forgotten god is this: if the oracle was a lie, and the true source of its power was a force of nature that had no interest in humanity, what does that say about the very nature of faith and the grand stories we tell ourselves about the gods? The magnificent facade of the Oracle of Delphi was a lie, a grand deception that lasted for 1,000 years. This is a mainstream historical fact, the truth that the Greek world never wanted to acknowledge. The myth of Apollo's divine oracle was a historical cover-up, a deliberate act by the priests and the powerful to perpetuate a convenient and controllable source of wisdom. The raw, unfiltered truth of the oracle's chthonic origins was too dangerous, too destabilizing to be released to the public. It would have shattered the very foundation of Greek faith, the very idea of benevolent gods who watched over their mortal subjects. A quirky detail, a footnote in ancient texts, describes a bizarre ritual that took place after every Pythia's death. The priests would not just perform funerary rites, they would perform a bizarre ritual of purification, where they would physically scour the inner sanctum. It's not to cleanse it, but to erase all trace of the Pythia's personal life, her memories, her personality. They would destroy her personal belongings, her simple robes, her small artifacts. This was not an act of devotion. It was an act of control. They were not just burying a person, they were burying a human soul, a memory that would have revealed the terrible truth of her suffering. They were sanitizing the past to protect the lie of the future. This historical cover-up is the oracle's final and most profound legacy. The priests and scribes, the very men who were meant to serve as the guardians of truth, were the ones who were perpetuating the lie. They created the myth of the oracle as a wise, all-knowing force, when in reality it was a broken, traumatized human being whose words were being co-opted for their own selfish ends. The oracle was not a source of wisdom. It was a prison, a monument to a lie that was so magnificent and so all-encompassing that it was impossible for anyone to see the truth. The question that remains is this: if the most sacred and revered source of wisdom in the ancient world was built on a foundation of lies and human suffering, what does that say about the nature of all faith, of all organized religion, and of all the great stories we tell ourselves about the gods? The oracle is now silent. The last Pythia has drawn her final breath, and the priests, their lie exposed, are left with a temple that is nothing more than a magnificent and empty tomb. The silence that remains is not a silence of peace, but a silence of profound and terrifying emptiness. It is the silence of a lie that has been exposed, a silence that rings with the echoes of 1,000 broken souls. This is the chilling final reality of the oracle's dark and unknowable secrets. The forbidden knowledge of the oracle was not a secret of the future, it was a secret of the past. It was the truth that the gods were not what they seemed, that the earth was a more powerful and terrifying entity than any Olympian, and that the greatest prophecies were born not of divine wisdom, but of human suffering. A quirky detail, a final whisper from the thanic power of the mountain, is the way the air around the temple seemed to grow colder after the oracle's last breath. It was not a change in temperature, but a psychic change, a chilling realization that the warm, human presence of a Pythia, no matter how broken, was gone forever, replaced by the cold, indifferent consciousness of the earth itself. The mountain, now freed from the burden of its human conduit, returned to its own silent geological pace. It would continue to remember, but it would no longer speak. The whispers of the serpent, the hum of the stones, the echoes of 1,000 unresolved fates, they are all still there. But they are now a part of a silence so profound, so complete, that it is terrifying. The oracle is gone, and the forbidden knowledge it contained is no longer a tool of a god or a burden to a human. It is a part of the earth itself, a cold, unblinking truth that simply exists waiting for a new human to be foolish enough to listen. The sun now sets over the silent slopes of Mount Parnassus. The wind whispers through the empty, crumbling columns of the Temple of Apollo, no longer carrying the scent of incense, but the scent of cold stone and forgotten secrets. The grand myths and legends of the oracle are now just stories, a magnificent and terrible tale of lies and suffering, and the profound, terrifying power of the earth. But as the darkness falls and the stars begin to emerge in the velvet sky, you can still feel it that low. Rhythmic thrumming in the ground, a silent, powerful voice that calls to you from the earth's own ancient heart. The oracle is silent, but the forbidden knowledge is still there, and it is waiting. It will always be waiting.